it started with a change. An athlete all her life, Billie Jean King had avidly played softball and other sports, such as football and track, throughout most of her childhood. Encouraged by her father, Bill Moffitt, she and her brother, Randy Moffitt, had a very athletically centered childhood. Billie Jean was an outspoken child and realized at a young age that girls were not given as much attention as boys when they spoke out. Growing up in the middle of the second-wave feminist movement, Billie Jean was a child during a time when women were beginning to realize that they did not have to live as housewives and were capable of the same things as men. After Billie Jean realized that she could not make a living out of softball or football, she opted to switch to a different sport. When her good friend, Susan Williams, asked if she wanted to try tennis at their country club, Billie Jean quickly accepted. Soon Billie Jean was asking her neighbors for odd jobs to make money to buy her first tennis racket, which she eventually purchased with $8.29 from Brown's Sporting Goods. At age 11, Billie Jean recognized that tennis was a largely elitist sport and that it was dominated by white people. King's first experience with the sexism against women in the sports world happened at age 12, when she wasn't allowed to be photographed with the other participants of the Southern California Junior Championships because she wasn't wearing a tennis skirt like the other girls were. She wanted to make tennis a platform for reform for women's sports. That first day, I really fell in love with tennis, she later said about the first day she attended the free tennis lessons taught by Clyde Walker at Houghton Park in Long Beach, California.
The person I met the second time I picked up a racket was Clyde Walker. He was the instructor for the Long Beach Parks and Recs. I was 11, and that day with Clyde at Houghton Park changed my whole life. At the end of that day, I decided I wanted to be the #1 tennis player in the world.
Winning her first Wimbledon doubles championship in 1961 with her partner, Karen Hance, King quickly established her dominance in the tennis world. This tournament, however, also gave King a real-life experience of the disparity between the value placed on men's and women's tennis championships. Because tennis was an amateur sport, prize money was dealt with under the table and was awarded for simply showing up at the tournament. The small sum did not fully compensate the players for their work and dedication. After Wimbledon, King attended college at California State University in Los Angeles, where she met her future husband, Larry King. King left college in 1964 in order to pursue her tennis career full-time, knowing that as a woman she would have to dedicate all of her time to the sport in order to make a living. Billie Jean King's continuing legacy would not have been possible without the fame she gained from her tennis accomplishments. Ranking #1 in the world 5 times between 1966 and 1974, King went on to win a record 20 Wimbledon championships, 39 Grand Slam titles, and in 1971 was the first woman to earn over $100,000 in one season.
Hello?
Hello, Mr. President?
Yes, I just wanted to congratulate you on your great successes this year, and I'm glad to see a fellow Californian gets over the 100,000.
Well, thank you very much.
King's tennis prominence created a platform for her fight for women's equality in sports, a stage she had craved since she was young. Her hope was that her fight for women's equality in sports would contribute to the second-wave feminist movement. In 1970, Billie Jean King, along with 8 other women, banded together to form the Virginia Slims Tour. This tour was designed to give women a place to play tennis, as the number of tournaments in which women's events were held was decreasing. To revolt against the disparity in women's versus men's prize money, as well as the decreasing number of opportunities for women to play, these 9 women signed $1 contracts and created the Virginia Slims Tour. All of these 9 women, Rosemary Casals, Val Ziegenfuss, Christy Pigeon, Julie Heldman, Nancy Rishi, Carrie Melville, Peaches Bartkowitz, Judy Dalton, and Billie Jean King, later known as the Original 9, wanted to prove that the women could bring in just as much revenue as the men, and that people wanted to watch them play just as much as the men. Billie Jean surveyed spectators at the 1971 U.S. Open to see if they came to the tournament to watch the women play as well as the men. According to Jane O'Hara, a female former professional tennis player from Canada, the answer was a resounding yes. After tennis became a professional sport in 1968, women were, at some tournaments, making 1/8 of the men's salary. At the 1970 Italian Open, Billie Jean King won the tournament and was awarded $600, while in contrast, the men's victor was awarded $3,500. The Virginia Slims Tour was sponsored by the Philip Morris Cigarette Company. By 1971, the prize money for the winner of the tournament totaled $309,100 for approximately 40 players. Title IX was passed in 1972 as an effect of the second-wave feminist movement, and the passage of the bill coincided with the beginning years of the Virginia Slims Tour. The bill stated that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The bill was inspired by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was meant to end racial discrimination. Under Title IX, educational institutions had to provide equal opportunities for women and men. Whether or not an institution was in compliance with the law was later determined by a 3-point test. If a school had a male and female admission rate roughly equal to the percentages of athletes of each gender, had a history of program expansion for the underrepresented gender, or offered opportunities desired by the underrepresented gender, then the institution was considered in compliance with Title IX. Before the bill was passed, roughly 300,000 girls participated in school athletic programs, and 28 years after the bill was passed, about 2.5 million girls participated in these programs. This massive growth can be compared to the relatively moderate growth in the participation rate of males in these years. While Billie Jean King's legacy is filled with examples of her fight against the inequalities of the women's sports world both during and after her tennis career, her biggest battle took place on September 20th, 1973. The Battle of the Sexes was Billie Jean King's chance to draw attention to Title IX and make it real in the minds of the public. Bobby Riggs, a 55-year-old tennis retiree, was the self-proclaimed male chauvinist pig. Through his sexist and misogynistic comments, Riggs declared that women were meant to be homemakers and belong in the bedroom and kitchen, in that order. He then proceeded to challenge some of the most prominent women's tennis players, including Margaret Court, an Australian Grand Slam champion, and Billie Jean King. Margaret lost her match against Riggs, and from that point, Billie Jean knew she would have to play him to contradict the statement that had just been made by Riggs' victory over Court. Riggs' views largely represented the views of the majority of the male athletes, making the match representative of the generally clashing views of men and women athletes. When Billie Jean accepted Riggs' challenge, the match was immediately scheduled for a primetime slot on September 20th, 1973. The event's true meaning, to show how women's and men's sports were equal and should be treated as such, was hidden under numerous layers of showmanship and hype. Riggs spent the time preceding the match playing to the crowd, while King stayed out of the limelight, focusing on strategy to beat Riggs. When the day of the match arrived, King began to treat the match with as much ridiculousness as Riggs acted with from his challenge. She rode out in a glittery litter carried by men that she had acquired a half an hour before the match, while Riggs entered in a rickshaw pulled by women. The broadcast was viewed by roughly 50 million people, and the $100,000 winner-take-all prize created an electric atmosphere around the stadium. Billie Jean beat Bobby in straight sets. With the victory, she showed the world that women were not to be disrespected, and that women's sports and athletes were just as serious and fit as men. Billie Jean and Bobby Riggs remained friends after the match. The win shut down doubts about whether or not women's and men's sports should be treated equally, as well as awarded equally. King's victory over Riggs contributed largely to the second-wave feminist movement, and showed that women were not to be underestimated. Billie Jean became president of the Women's Tennis Association in 1974, after helping create the organization in 1973. Billie Jean also contributed to closing the disparity between men's and women's prize money, which lowered in 1976 and 1977. Billie Jean's involvement with the Virginia Slims Tour also led to the creation of the Women's Tennis Association Tour, which in 2012 hosted more than 2,500 players and $96 million in prize money. Billie Jean King's legacy is one of fighting against unfair disparities. Billie Jean King's participation in the Battle of the Sexes frames her as one of the biggest advocates for women's equality in history. Her annihilation of Bobby Riggs showed the world that women could stand up and fight, and that they were not to be marginalized. When she received the Elizabeth Blackwell Award for Service to Humanity, she said, "Everything I do is about equal opportunity. Race, gender, sexual orientation. Let's get over it. Let's celebrate our differences."
You can bend but never break me, 'cause it only serves to make me more determined.